Okay, good afternoon everybody. It is time for us to begin, and we always have quite a lot of to cover here because hopefully we can have a little bit of a discussion and also go over all the material. And I hope you watched the video on YouTube because it should give you some introduction, and I also hope you had successful experience reading the assigned readings on MindTap. Are there any issues you guys want to talk about first with MindTap or anything like that? Anybody had anything they struggle with? I definitely encourage you to read the discussions there on Canvas regarding MindTap and Canvas, and Cengage, because there's a lot of good information. And I actually found out a lot of good stuff for myself, and I'm sure you will find it too. I read, of course, all sections, but I think pretty much every section had something very useful. And by the way, couple of words regarding, well, the course key. Take a look at the syllabus. It does say there what course key is very specifically. So on syllabus, there are instructions how to go on MindTap. Although actually just because it is now connected directly to Canvas, I would recommend not using that link, but instead going into assignments on Canvas and using the link there. But otherwise, it is all pretty much the same, and it has a course key. You shouldn't even need the course key if you go through Canvas, because Canvas section is directly linked to the specific section on MindTap related to this class. So if you're going through some other road, they may actually tell you that they may block you and tell you that you have to go through Canvas. And keep that in mind, because I got a number of messages about that. If it's linked to Canvas, they don't want you to go any other road because they want to make sure that you are indeed the student of this class. So even if you already have an account or whatever, that may be problematic. Just go on assignments. You will see in assignments there is like an assignment link which you click on, and then it takes you to actually another link which you again click on, and it should take you right into this section. So you shouldn't need the course key. But if you need a course key for whatever reason, it's on syllabus. Anything else? I want to clarify about extra credit too, because I get some questions about that. How does extra credit exactly work for the discussions? Well, remember, extra credit is extra, right? So I'm actually feel completely free to give it to whoever I think deserves it, and not to give it to other students. It's not something you actually earn. It's just kind of like extra, which I give to students who are very active and so on. So there's no clear criteria, right? I will look at the discussions. If I see somebody contributing, saying interesting things, really kind of getting into this, then I give extra credit. And I do give extra credit to students all the time. But in the same time, I may even overlook something, because know that there's lots of comments, right? So just because you posted a comment doesn't mean you automatically get extra credit, because I cannot really keep track of every single comment and every single person who comments. But you can be rest assured that if you regularly there and regularly contribute, you will get at least some extra credit for that. There is no doubt about that. And we'll have more extra credit during these live sessions, because your section, unlike all the other sections I teach, actually has the live session, so you can participate in that. Other students cannot do it. There's 4 other sections which I teach, and they are fully online. So even though they watch this video later if they want to, because I upload it on YouTube, but they cannot go live. And that's just the way CSN decided that we should teach this semester. So it's not even my decision or anything, that's just how they did it. We'll teach one section with this kind of web remote live sessions, and all the other sections for each professor are fully online. And my guess is the reasoning is many students didn't even want to attend the live sessions, so then in the end of last semester I was teaching 5 of them live, and in the end, believe it or not, I had 3 or 4 students showing up to the sessions. So that was just ridiculous. Teaching 5, repeating the same stuff 5 times for 3 or 4 students in each one section. So the idea now is people who signed up for this class, for this particular section, actually want to have live discussions and want to have live interaction. So they all should be here. Students who don't care about it, don't have time, don't have to do it, so then they are not required to participate, at least not in live sessions, and they are not required to attend them, unlike you guys, who actually are required. Even though I don't take attendance, but note that it's all registered. As soon as you sign in, it actually is registered on Canvas that you are here and for how long you are here. So all this stuff I can, check that anytime. In the end of the semester, when I assign grades, I can just look up how many of the sessions you attended. I don't have to keep any track of that. It's all being tracked automatically. So keep all this in mind. Okay, so now let's get back to philosophy, because we barely actually scratched the philosophy itself. We talked so much about how the class and how it's going to be going and everything, that philosophy kind of slips away a little bit. But today we will dive right into it. Chapter 2 in general is on early Greek philosophy, the pre-Socratic philosophy. Why is it called pre-Socratics? Well, you will see when we get to Socrates, he's kind of a very key figure in many ways. Everything before Socrates is, we don't know that much about it, and it is kind of always put together, but it is important in the same time. And today, maybe one important question we want to figure out is, when did philosophy begin? When did it begin? If you watched the video, you probably already know the answer. If you did the reading, you may have an answer, although they don't really specify it in this way. But nonetheless, this is the question. So remember that if you looked at this discussion and if you looked what I posted there, we had a poem. And the poem is, of course, very beautiful. But it doesn't really give us good idea about what is philosophy. In fact, it may be a little bit confusing, and I noticed that a lot of students got a little bit confused about that because I asked what is wrong with it, and lots of students were saying there is nothing wrong with it. It's such a beautiful poem. Well, as a poem, it is of course beautiful and great, but this is not what we are looking for. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, going with the slides. So we started in ancient Greece. Why are we starting in Greece and not in some other part of the world? Well, the best way to explain that is the class is about Western philosophy. Why is it about Western philosophy? Well, we live in a Western society, right? Everything about this society is closely linked to this philosophy. I'm sure there are many beautiful things you can learn about African philosophy or Asian philosophy and so on, but it will not explain to you why do we have the system we have, including democratic system of government, for example, and also capitalism as economic system. Note that these economic and political systems are very closely related to this development of Western philosophy as we know it. And in order to understand it, we do have to go back to its root, which actually happens to be in ancient Greece. So for this reason, we are not going to go into China or Japan, as interesting as they are. We're going to go to ancient Greece. Now, Greeks in particular not only asked all these interesting questions, which we will be covering, such as what is the nature of the universe? What is the purpose of human existence? What is our relation to divine forces? Not only did they ask them, but they actually tried to answer them in a systematic, rational way. And this is the most important thing to understand. There is a difference between just wondering about this stuff. the way poets, for example, did, and actually trying to figure it out using your reason, using your analytical thought, using logic. Note that this is why, again, Philosophy 102, which is many of you either took or will probably take at some point, because it required too many different majors, is philosophy, even though it actually is very different from this class, because it is a lot more rigorous, and it's just that system itself, the system of rational thought, without any kind of talk about its development, how did it come about, why did it come about. You're just given the result there. You're given what we consider critical thinking, and critical thinking is, again, that rational approach, rational, rigorous approach to the subject. Okay, so this is why we're going back to Greece, and again, remember, democracy. Democracy is actually Greek word. Demos means people. Kratos means the power of the people. This is where it all began. In Greek civilization, around 2000 before Common Era, which is about 4,000 years ago, this is where the very first roots of the Greek civilization, not yet the democracy, but the Greek civilization itself, took place, and eventually they developed into this kind of characteristic institutions called polis. Polis is like a town or a small city, city-state. And this is where later they developed, in the 5th century BCE, they developed democracy. Now, by the way, again, I explained it in the video, but just to give you better understanding, how many of you know what BCE stands for? What does it actually mean, BCE, before Common Era? How do we count this? Do you guys know? Because we will be using it all the time now. Well, before, yeah, it's before Christ, before Common Era, but what does it mean? So, for example, if we say the year 500 before BCE, what is it? How many years ago was it? Well, how many years ago? No, it would not be 2021. If you go 2021 years ago, it will be year 0, right? How about 500 BCE? How many years ago was that? Yeah, 2521, because note that we are counting backwards from the birth of Christ, right? So, birth of Christ, well, there's really no year 0 as such, but the birth of Christ is kind of a point 0, we can say. This would be where Christ was born, and we live in the year 2021 after that. So 2021 years ago, well, at least supposedly Christ was born. Why supposedly? Because they don't know if that's the exact date. Nobody knows the exact date of Christ's birth. It is plus minus 3 years or something. But nonetheless, this is the point when they decided, let's consider that year a year of Christ's birth. However, if we go before that, we go backwards in time, kind of in this direction. So right here would be year 10 before Christ, 20, 100, 200, and so on. So it is a little bit counterintuitive, because when we talk about this period, we're counting backwards. A year 500 actually further away in time than the year 400. And the year 400 is more recent. And the year 300 is even more recent. Naturally, they did not count it like this. They had the different calendars in ancient Greece. This is what we do today, just in our terms, to figure out when it happened. So this is kind of important to understand for those of you who don't understand, because you may be confused about these dates kind of going backwards. Okay. So, going back to the subject of when did philosophy begin and how did it begin, the story, as we should start it, begins with poetry. Poets played very important part in Greek society. Poetry obviously began even before they started writing it down, and one of the big reasons why they started doing poetry rather than prose is, what do you think? What's the big reason they decided to use poems? Well, it spreads faster because it's easy to remember, right? Try to remember a text which has no rhyme. That's very, very daunting. It's possible, but difficult. You will have trouble. But know that songs and poems are much easier to remember because they rhyme, so it kind of goes easier into your head. So if you don't have any writing tools, poetry is an excellent way to remember it, repeat it, and give it to other people. So this is essentially one of the reasons. So they were trying to answer these questions about reality, which we still have today, but they were doing it in those poems because that seemed to them the best way to approach it. In particular, if you looked at this poem by Hesiod, which is in the discussion, he is trying to answer these questions too. He's trying to tell us how did the world begin. Very interesting, indeed very poetic and nice, but what is his approach? How is he doing that? He collected all the stories passed on through myths and tradition. They were accumulating that for centuries, passing it on from generation to generation. So this is what he tried to kind of summarize and organize in a nice way. This is what Hesiod did. But note that he did not do it just so we would be entertained. It's not entertainment. It's not even really art to him. It actually is an attempt to explain how did the world begin. They literally believed that this is how it began. Many functions associated with poetry were very important for the Greek society. Religious function, this is one of the key, most important functions. So they were trying to figure out, they didn't have priests or churches the way we have today, but they were trying to still figure out the same questions, right? How should you pray? Who are the gods? Or is there one God? And most people got it from this poetry, in particular from Hesiod. Before Hesiod, from Homer. Homer lived somewhat before Hesiod, probably around 800 BC, Hesiod around 700 BC. It's very approximate because clearly we have trouble determining exactly when that all happened. But so about, in other words, about 2800 years ago. And they were trying to give some idea about how to pray to gods and ethical function. Remember what ethics is? We talked about the most important divisions of philosophy last time. So what is ethics? What is ethics deals with? Morals, exactly. So what should you do in your daily life? What should you not do? Why is it wrong to do certain actions? So, yeah, and virtue, in a sense, like, who is a virtuous person? Who should we, as residents of the polis, consider to be virtuous? What type of resident? Fellow resident. And they were also getting all this from those poems based on mythology, based on myths, such as the one you saw in this poem. They were explaining to them those familiar things which we see around us even today, and they also saw the exact same thing. They saw one day it could be rainy, right? It's today rainy in Las Vegas. Why is it raining? What's going on? Well, maybe it is God crying or something. Or, I don't know, carrying water and it spilled. This is some of the explanations they were using. So those familiar things which they saw around themselves, they were trying to explain in this kind of mythological way. Greek gods in particular, based on those stories, based on those myths, were, first of all, multiple. They had many, many gods. Second of all, they were what is known as anthropomorphic. What does it mean, anthropomorphic? It means anthropos, in ancient Greece, in ancient Greek, is a human being. A man, to be particular, but they called human beings man. So anthropos is a human being. Anthropomorphic means just like human beings. So their gods were just like human beings in every possible sense of the word. They were easily offended. The god could get mad at you. They were vengeful. They could, hold a grudge and then avenge you if they didn't like something that you've done. They were also deceitful. They could lie to you and to each other. And they played favorites. So, for example, if somebody had a good life and another person didn't, Greeks could say, well, maybe God's just like him for whatever reason. Maybe they like his face or something, right? That was their explanation. So, even though they had this enormous power, they were also very immature, we may say. Well, yeah, that is one of the stories. So the Greek myths actually describe all this stuff in a variety of ways. Now, this is one of the illustrations of the Greek gods. Now, the most important one was Zeus, god of the. Let me make it a little bit bigger. God of the ray. Then they also had Hades, god of death. Poseidon, god of the sea. So, for example, people who would be sailors who would sail in the sea, they would pray to Poseidon, and they would ask Poseidon to preserve them and help them. That was kind of part of the ritual when their boats would depart from the harbor. They would give a prayer to Poseidon, and even they had this libation and all sorts of ceremonies, pouring a libation, asking Poseidon to take care of them, and so on. But note that gods, according to them, really didn't have to do any of that. They could take care of you if they feel like it, but they could also get mad at you and send some sort of a thunder, and then lightning will strike and kill you. And you may be wondering, why did that happen? Well, you're probably not going to be wondering if you're killed, but let's say somebody killed, and you're wondering, why did gods kill that person? What happened? But there would be no explanation, because the explanation could be, well, they were in a bad mood this day. Zeus was in a bad mood, and he was throwing lightning bolts, and there was this person, so he killed him. That's it. So, what is problematic about this picture? What exactly is wrong with it? What do you think is wrong with this kind of explanation? Is there anything wrong with it, or does it work just fine? If you want to answer with your microphone, feel free to turn it on and answer it this way, because otherwise it sometimes takes us very long time to wait for somebody to type. And I'm not even sure if anybody is typing. Sometimes people are typing and it says typing, but nothing comes out. So I'm just waiting, and that's it. Well, there's not much of a way to prove anything, but there's a much bigger problem. Think about it. It's completely unpredictable. You cannot predict that. So how are you going to behave? The answer to this is, you really don't know. Whatever you do, gods can still get mad at you. Well, maybe you can do some sacrifices. That's what they were doing, right? Sacrifices to the gods. They would kill some animal and give him to the gods. That did not guarantee, the good response from the gods, because gods can still, for whatever reason, not accept it or not like it. Nonetheless, that was pretty much the only way. So if you want to have good crops next season, if you're growing crops, what's your way to please the gods? Well, give them a sacrifice or pray. Do you think it would work very well? Well, maybe by coincidence, but I kind of really doubt it. I doubt that if you sacrifice a nice lamb to the gods, that will somehow help you to have good crops. It seems unlikely, right? You may even use stronger word, it is pretty much impossible. So that wasn't working very well. And that's one of the reasons why this particular account of reality is not very useful. It kind of gives you sort of comfort knowing that things happen because gods or whoever wanted it to happen, but it doesn't really help you to structure your own life, assuming you can do something about, for example, getting good crops. And between, let's say, sacrificing a lamb or taking better care of your garden or wherever it is you are growing your crops or whatever, I'm thinking the second is probably more productive. The first, which is lamb sacrifice, probably not as productive. And that's the kind of problem they were obviously facing. Nonetheless, for a long time, this poetic kind of tradition was very, very important for the Greeks. This is Homer, again, the famous blind bard whose poetry was very, very institutional in Greek society, and children would grow up knowing his work and thinking about how they should behave in life based on it. In particular, Xenophanes, who is one of the later philosophers, said, all at first have learned according to Homer, talking about their society. So they learned how to behave, they learned how to conduct themselves and how to pray to gods from Homer. And what did they learn there? What exactly was the type of conduct they were looking for? Well, the virtues according to Homer are virtues of a warrior hero. A warrior and a hero. Personal excellence. Stuff like success, honor, power, wealth, moderation, security, courage, loyalty, and patriotism. So, in other words, the virtuous person, the ideal person, would be successful, honorable, preferably of good birth, because they did believe that good birth is important. So if your parents come from nice lineage, maybe even like related directly to gods or something, then of course you are more noble than other people. And if not, well, too bad, because that's one of the things which kind of decided for you at birth. But then also you're supposed to conduct yourself accordingly. It's not enough to have a good birth. You also have to proceed with moderation and be courageous, loyal, and patriotic to your polis. Again, note the polis was the main kind of what we today consider a state for them, and this little town or bigger town was like their actual community which they closely related to. Even though Greek language and Greek culture was quite widespread, the Hellenic world, but nonetheless this in this sense they all had their own polis. Different poli, and the plural of polis is poli, different poli actually had their different laws, different constitutions, different government, and also even different gods. There were differences in terms of which specific gods they were considered to be more important, less important, or even not important at all. Okay, so this is how they lived for a very long time. And again, this is the poem we had for discussion. For those of you who did not look at the discussion or whatever, let's just take a look at it again. So it starts very nicely. It's by Hesiod, who lived a little bit after Homer. First of all, chaos came into being. Next came broad-breasted Gaia, the earth. Gaia is actually what they considered to be the earth. So the earth in brackets here is just kind of a translation of the word Gaia, and so on. So it describes the creation of the world starting from chaos. And this is something which we actually talked about in discussion. A number of students asked about that. Yes, the word chaos in ancient Greek did not have the same meaning as we use today. When we say, oh, it's total chaos, we actually mean a mess, right? That's not what they meant. In fact, in ancient Greek, the word chaos meant a gap between something. So first came this gap when the earth separated from Tartarus. And that's actually what he means here. When the earth separated, the earth appeared and the Tartarus appeared, and between them there was a gap, and that gap is the chaos. Yeah, there are quite a few names. He was trying to trace all that, and again, based on tradition, based on mythology, based on whatever stories he heard himself, he was trying to summarize it, put it all together, make sense of it. He literally believed in all that stuff. He thought this is exactly how things happen. This is the best they at the time could actually figure out what was going on. And so the idea was not just entertainment, the idea was actually to figure it out. Okay, this is kind of a better illustration about the world picture of the world according to Hesiod. So note that the earth is actually like a flat plate. This is the earth. It's like a plate. Why is it flat? Well, doesn't it make sense? If it's not flat, we will all fall, right? It has to be flat. And doesn't it look flat? So it is flat. It's like a plate, and there is ocean like a river flowing around it. This is ocean. Now it has a couple of gates which connect to Tartarus. Tartarus is an underworld. This is where you go when you die. And then there's also heaven, which is something we can see if we look up. But there are also gaps on top and on the bottom between the earth and heaven and between the earth and Tartarus. So this is how he thought about the universe, and again in a very literal sense. Okay, so the first group of philosophers we'll be talking about, they come from Ionia. They called Ionians, in particular from the city called Meletas. Now where is it? Well, this is the map of this part of Greece. So this is Ionia. Note that what Greece is today is this. This is Greece today. And there's Athens right here. This today is Turkey. It's no longer part of Greece. But at the time, this coast of Turkey was actually populated by Hellenic people. And Meletas, which is right here, you see, that's Meletas. That was one of the important towns. So they are still considered Greek, even though today, like I said, if today you go to this area, that is Turkey, and they do have some remnants of this Greek civilization on the coast, but naturally it's very different in all other ways. But at the time, this area, and even broader area, was all part of this Greek world, so that's why we are talking about them as Greeks. They spoke the same language, Greek language, and the culture was also rather similar everywhere. So even though they had different governments, we can still consider them part of the same area. And this is again Ionia and the city of Miletus. So for this reason they are called Ionians or Miletans. So again, back to our question. How did Western philosophy actually get born? Because what we talked about just now, Homer and Hesiod, is not philosophy. It's poetry. What exactly is the difference? Well, of course you may say that it's hard to pin a particular date. It's not like there was no philosophy yesterday and then tomorrow there's philosophy. But we can actually pick a date which we can use for our purposes, and that date would be 585 BC. 585 BC, 2606 years ago. That is as good a date as any. Why? Why do we pick this date? And by the way, the period, the first philosophic period we'll be talking about is known as cosmological period. During this period, first philosophers were mainly concerned with these two questions. What is fundamentally real? What is everything made of? And another one, why does change happen? Why do things change? Okay, so 585 BCE, the following thing happened. This is from Herodotus. This is a quote from Herodotus, ancient historian who lived again later than Thales, but nonetheless describing the event. He's saying, as they were having equal success in the war, and there was the war at the time, it happened that in the 6th year, when a battle was being fought, the day suddenly became night. Talos of Meletas had foretold to the Ionians that this loss of daylight would occur, setting as a limit the very year in which the event occurred. So in other words, he predicted the solar eclipse. He said, probably wasn't able to determine a date. Nonetheless, according to Herodotus, Thales of Meletas said that in year which today we call 585, there will be a solar eclipse. And because it was during the war, and because they had a battle, you can imagine that they were quite impressed. They were fighting, right? When people are fighting, when they are dying, they obviously are very superstitious. They're looking at all sorts of signs which may, show them that it will be successful or not successful. And then suddenly the sun is covered by the shadow of the moon, as we know today. But they obviously did not know that. And so what are they thinking? Wait a minute! Remember that guy Thales? He actually said it will happen. How did he know? Is it possible? So this is a huge thing, especially for that period of time. Talos of Meletas. This is who we today call the first philosopher. Roughly, he lived around 624, 545 BCE. We don't know exactly. This is very, very approximate, based on some of the other events. He is considered the first philosopher, and this is considered that kind of important event. No work of his survived. We don't know exactly much about his ideas because there's no written evidence of any kind. We do, however, have some evidence passed on through others. There's quite a bit which Aristotle later has written about him, and we do have this work by Aristotle. Also Plato mentioned him, and so on. So that is an actual person. He was considered one of the wise men, one of the sages, one of the wisest people of the period. Okay, let's have a little bit of a discussion about that because this is very important. So, how do you think a poet would have explained solar or lunar eclipse? Say Hesiod, how would he explain something like that? Yeah, so in other words, he would probably make up some beautiful story, right? Like one of the gods threw his cape or something and covered it. Very beautiful.
You might know it was an omen or a sign of luck, depending on the context.
Well, yeah, that's another thing. But how is it different from philosopher? Well, note that the question philosopher would ask is there any rational explanation to that? Is there any kind of explanation you can actually figure out based on some sort of laws? Can you figure out whether it will happen in the future? Now, how exactly did they figure out that it will happen in the future? Well, I can tell you that the best approximation we have about it is they were looking at the history of how often does it happen. And there's actually certain periods of time when solar eclipses happen. So if you keep track over many, many years, you can actually look at this and say, oh, look at that. It was happening like, say, every 36 years or something. And even though that was not very precise, but it kind of gives you an idea, well, wait a minute. If it was happening every 36 years, wouldn't it make sense that 36 years after the last time it happened, it would happen again? So note the crucial difference here. If one of the gods threw his cape or sent a sign or something like that, there's no way to predict it. But if it is actually the law of nature of some sort, if it happens not because the gods felt mad or whatever, but because there's some sort of consistency to that, then you can actually predict that. And this is exactly what Thales did. So as beautiful as poetic explanation is, it is completely useless. It may make you feel good or whatever, comforting. It's not going to help you very much in terms of the future. And the first evidence of somebody actually trying to step away from that and say, okay, it's all great, beautiful, and so on. They were not rejecting gods. They were not atheists by any sense. But how about we try to look at the consistency and try to figure out whether this stuff happens based on something other than caprice of the gods. And this is where philosophic approach begins. And note again, and I said about it in the video, at that point and for centuries, even for thousands of years after that, there was no difference between science and philosophy. We started distinguishing science from philosophy only about 200 years ago. Prior to that, philosophy was science and science was philosophy. End of story. The philosophers were the first scientists. So don't be confused about that. Today, because we have this distinguishing science such as physics, chemistry, and so on, people who major in philosophy or something think that philosophy, or at least people who want to major in philosophy, think that it's just, this pointless wondering about this useless stuff. Oh no. It's just that because we already have this kind of clear scientific approaches in physics, chemistry, and so on, we kind of push all the questions which are not answered by physics, chemistry, and so on into this discipline of philosophy, such as metaphysics, for example, and it may start to appear like what philosophy itself deals with are useless questions. They are not useless by any sense. They are some of the most fundamental questions we ever had and will ever have as human beings. It's just many of them still do not have any answers because science still is unable to give it to us. But nonetheless, it's by no means pointless. It is very, very important. Okay, so couple of words. By the way, when you talk about ancient Greece, it's very important to understand that Greek language they were using, the ancient Greek, is different from English. And for this reason, we have to use some of the ancient Greek words. If we don't, it will be difficult to understand what is going on. So periodically I'll throw them at you guys, and we're not going to learn ancient Greek language because that would be a little crazy for introductory class. Even though note that if you are seriously considering philosophy, you may want to take some introductory Greek classes. People who seriously go into philosophy do want to know this in the original language because that gives you completely different perspective. No translation can ever give credit to this stuff. But for us, just a few words will suffice. And a couple of important words to find out right away is physis and cosmos. Because we use them in English today, well, we don't use physis, but we use physics, right? And this is one of the words which is very, very closely related to this Greek word physis. But we kind of changed it a lot. The word physics is not the same. It's related, it's not the same. And the word cosmos, which we do use in English, but also is not the same word. So what exactly did they mean at the time? Physis of something. They were talking about physis when they were trying to describe exactly how something works. The fundamental reasoning behind it, which could kind of explain to you what it is. For example, how would you give a physis of water? Well, today you can give a physis of water by giving H2O, the chemical formula, and explaining that water has 2 parts of hydrogen and 1 part of oxygen. That would be physis, right? So when they were looking for physis, and they were called physikoi, these first philosophers, they were looking for something like that. They were looking to understand exactly what things are. And again, physics today is kind of very closely related to this word. And cosmos. The word cosmos first appears as early as Homer. What did cosmos mean for Homer? It meant when warriors go into battle, if they have very nicely structured ranks, that was cosmos. So in other words, cosmos meant order. Order and very precise construction. So when they started talking about universe and trying to understand how does universe work, the idea that universe might have some sort of order was described by the word cosmos. So when today we talk about cosmos, we mean like outer space. But for them, cosmos was the entire universe. And the idea again was that it has to be rationally ordered in some way. So unlike this kind of chaotic idea of the poets that, oh, things just happen for whatever different reasons, the idea of cosmos is the idea that there is some structure and laws governing the entire thing, which can actually be learned by the human beings. Okay, another word which can be useful too is the word arche. They were looking for arche. What exactly is arche? Again, arche can be translated into English as the beginning. But if you just say the beginning, it is confusing because it does not really tell you what they were looking for. To them, arche is also something which underlies things, something which is in them, this kind of rational principle which guides them, and also the fundamental structure of them. So they were looking for arche. What the hell is the arche? You can see stuff around you, but what's in this stuff? How did it begin? How did it come about? And what's in it? This is some of the questions the first philosophers were concerned with. Okay, so according to Thales, again, and we mentioned Thales already, everything, the arche of everything was water. This is what we know on Aristotle's authority. Aristotle later told us, Thales thought that the origin of things was water. Everything is made of water. And the earth, actually in particular, also rests on water. It has to be. Why do you think he thought that the earth rests on water? Well, that kind of explains mostly, not, it answers that slightly different question, like why does everything made of water? But why does the earth rest on water? So water is the arche, right? So remember, arche has all these meanings. Yes, everything is made of water because that is the most constitutive element. But it also is the beginning of things, and the earth itself rests on it. Not just that. Think about it in these terms. You know that the earth is flat, right? You can see it. But what is it standing on? They were asking this question. What did Hesiod say? That there's a gap underneath and the gap on top, and there's Tartarus below it. Okay, well, Thales was probably asking, but still, like, does it make any sense? If there's a gap, wouldn't it fall down? But if you look at the water, if something is in the water, that kind of answers this question, doesn't it? Suppose you are throwing, I don't know, a wooden plate into the water. What will happen?
It'll either float or sink. So he's asking what's making the land float on water.
He's asking what is holding the land. What is going on? So the answer is water. If it is on water, it will be floating. Well, it can sink, but it can also float, because they could observe that if you put something on the water, it actually floats. So to them it made perfect sense that certain things float on water. Why can't Earth float on water too? Know that there's like this endless ocean all around, but the Earth could be floating there. So again, they were looking for this kind of rational explanation to this question, and the floating made sense. perhaps it is floating. Okay. So next, one of these three Ionian philosophers, which usually are all bunched together after Thales, was Anaximander. Anaximander was his student, we think. We're not really sure, but ancient tradition says he was his student, but he disagreed. He actually disagreed with his professor in many ways, as probably is a tradition, not just in philosophy, but in anything. And he did not think that the idea that everything is made of water made very much sense. So he actually suggested a different approach. He said, how about everything is made of different archaea? Apeiron. It actually is pronounced apeiron. The accent on the first syllable. Apeiron. Apeiron to him was the most fundamental element everything is made of, and apeiron can be roughly translated as stuff. Apeiron basically is something which has no limit, because peiron in Greek means limit, and apeiron means no limit. So limitless stuff, infinite, indefinite kind of stuff. Why did he say that? Well, because to him it made sense probably that water is not, even though you can find water, yes, in human beings and in plants and everything, it doesn't seem like everything is really made of water. Wouldn't it make more sense if there was some sort of different stuff which we just can't see? Some sort of special stuff? And that's essentially what he was saying. There are a couple of quotes from whatever we have from Aristotle, actually from Aristotle's Physics. Aristotle wrote later on, like 200 years later, but he nonetheless had access to some of the writings of Anaximander, and he told us that for some, make the infinite or apeiron this, namely something aside from the elements, rather than air or water, so that the others are not destroyed by the one of them that is infinite. For they contain oppositions with regard to one another. For example, air is cold, water wet, fire hot. If any one of them were infinite, the rest would already have been destroyed. But as it is, they declare that the thing from which all came is different. So, note what he means. In a slightly weird language, what Aristotle is telling us is that for Anaximander, it made no sense that any of these other elements would be most fundamental, because you see water, for example, destroyed by fire. Destroyed in what sense? Well, when you boil it, right? When you boil water, it disappears. And so on. So neither one of these elements seem to make any sense to be most fundamental. Whereas if there is something most fundamental, it would have to be something invisible, which is literally in everything. So that was his idea. Apeiron, or indefinite, or stuff, kind of an archaea of everything. And again, note that it's not just the most fundamental element. This is actually some stuff from which everything began. This stuff was there at the beginning, and then from that, things began to emerge, which he thinks is kind of natural process. Okay, don't want to spend too much time on this stuff. Another interesting idea that he had was about the earth. Anaximander said that the earth maybe doesn't actually rest on anything. It doesn't rest on water, but it also doesn't rest on anything else. And how did he justify that? He said, well, if it's in the center, note that this is his idea. So the earth is right here, right? It is still flat. It's like a puck, in ice hockey, the puck. That's kind of the idea of how the earth is. So it is flat on top, flat on the bottom, but round around the edges. But if it is equidistant from everything else, he thought that would actually make sense for it not to be on anything at all, because then nothing will kind of have any pull on it. So he suggested it's at the center. Then there is, of course, the moon, the sun, the stars he thought were kind of closer to it than anything else. But nonetheless, the Earth is at the center. That's one of the first ideas, as far as we know, that somebody suggested the Earth doesn't actually stand on any kind of elephants or water or anything else. It just by itself. Principle of sufficient reason, which the book chapter actually mentions and which will become more important in philosophy, is behind this kind of reasoning. So what's the principle of sufficient reason? Well, there has to be a reason for everything. Nothing happens without reason at all. So that kind of thinking here is, in order for the Earth to fall, for example, there has to be something forcing it to fall. It doesn't just fall by itself. And for this reason, if there is nothing working on it from any direction or everything works on it equally, it could be at the center. Again, note that it is like mildly scientific type of reasoning. And finally, the third guy of these three, Anaximenes, was a student of Anaximander in turn. And his idea was that he again disagreed with both Thales and Anaximander, and he thought maybe it is the air which is the most important element. Or in Greek it's pneuma. Pneuma is kind of like air. That's basically the way the book uses the word pneuma, but that actually means air. Why did he think it was air? Well, one reason, it is more pervasive. It's inside everything, isn't it? It's like pretty much everywhere. Another important reason he thought it is air is we associate air with life very closely. So, for example, if you have no air, you will die. And plants as well. They all need air. We need air to breathe. So doesn't it make sense that there's something fundamentally important about air if everything needs it? So maybe it is actually the archaea, the most fundamental element of anything. So that's one of the other ideas. They were all kind of disagreeing with each other. Then another interesting figure we really need to talk about is Xenophanes. Xenophanes lived a bit later than all of them, and he is considered a founder of a different school of philosophy in ancient Greece, the Eleatic school. So these three were Ionians. Eleatics we mainly will talk about next time, but how did they actually come about? Where did their ideas come from? We have to talk about Xenophanes. He was a poet himself. He was philosophically minded poet. He was writing in poetry, in poetic style. We have quite a few of his poems. Some of them just talk about celebrations and stuff like this. But they also approach two very important issues: epistemology and theology. Now, in terms of theology, he criticized Homer and Hesiod. Theology, again, that's the part of philosophy which deals with religious issues, with God. Theos in Greek means God. So what did he say? This is a couple of quotes from Xenophanes. Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all sorts of things that are matters of reproach and censure among men: theft, adultery, mutual deception. Men suppose that gods are brought to birth, have claws and voice and shape like their own. But if oxen and horses or lions had hands, or could draw and fashion works as men do, horses would draw the gods shaped like horses, and lions like lions, making the bodies of gods resemble their own forms. So what is he trying to say here? He's trying to say that human beings at that time, thinking about gods as a bunch of other human beings, simply because that's all they know. They know each other, so they're thinking gods must be like them. But he's saying that can't be true. That doesn't make any sense. If gods were just a bunch of like other humans, then also how come that people of different ethnic background think of their gods as resembling them? He's saying if horses could draw, they would probably draw their god like a horse. And if lions, they would draw a god like a lion. But that actually does not work. That's not philosophically making any sense. So from the point of view of reasoning, he was criticizing this approach. This is what he said about God. He said, God is one, greatest among gods and men, in no way like mortals, in either body or in mind. He sees as a whole, perceives as a whole, hears as a whole. Always he remains in the same place, not moving at all, nor indeed does it befit him to go here and there at different times. But without toil he makes all things shiver by the impulse of his mind. So basically he's saying that the God should not be like human being. The God should be all-powerful, makes all things shiver, just by his mind. He has no hands. He is not literally grabbing stuff. He doesn't have any clothes. So he criticizes this entire Homeric and Hesiodic idea of this bunch of different gods based on reasoning. Because to him, from the reasoning, from rational point of view, that makes no sense. Well, in terms of Christianity, remember Christianity, we will talk about Christianity a lot more, but it takes after Jewish religion. Judeo-Christian God comes back to the Jewish religion, which actually even predates this stuff. The Old Testament, the Bible of the Jewish people, goes back quite a bit further. So there is some connection here, but I don't know exactly how the Jewish people come up with their idea of God. Nonetheless, when Christianity emerged, Christianity will be greatly influenced by these Greek philosophers. In particular, they will, as we will talk about later, some connection in their ideas with Heraclitus, who comes up right after Xenophanes, and some other, and Plato in particular. Plato is like really, really at the foundation of Christianity. But Plato was ancient Greek. He lived just a little bit after these philosophers we are talking about right now. And he, in turn, was influenced by them. Plato knew about Xenophanes. So Plato actually is the one who influenced Christianity the most. Okay. But note that he did not come up to it based on the Bible. He came up to it based on his own reasoning. He was just saying, we, the Greeks, believe in these multiple gods who are like human, but that doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. Gods cannot be like human. Okay, so epistemology and skepticism. He, in particular, was criticizing the entire approach, this kind of poetic approach, which he thought wasn't rigorous enough. He was saying some of this stuff we can never know, but we can only have an opinion about them. There's a couple of good quotes from him. He's saying, no man has seen, nor will there be anyone who knows the clear truth about the gods and about all the things they speak of. For even if a person should in fact say what has come to pass, nevertheless he himself doesn't know. But in all cases, it is opinion that has been wrought. So in other words, when you talk about gods, you can't know for a fact, but you can have an opinion. And he's saying, my opinion is they can't be like human beings. It just doesn't make any sense. So he's saying, he's not denying that there are truths, but he's saying certain truths has no man seen. No man can possibly know exactly what gods are like. But nonetheless, not all opinions are equal. Okay, so now let's refresh a little bit from the last class and let's do it for extra credit. What is epistemology concerned with? Because note that we just said that this was epistemology, right? What is it concerned with? Knowledge, the theory of knowledge. So remember, when we are doing that kind of review, and we will do it every single class, not only you get extra credit, but that actually helps you in terms of the upcoming exam. Because there are questions on the review, and if you have the review, and you should have it because it's on the files there, the first question on the review is, what is epistemology concerned with? So this is kind of a review for the upcoming exam, right? Yeah, knowledge and truth. It's the theory of truth. So let me see. The first person who answered gets extra credit. In this case, William. And I'm taking names in this case very specifically. So, okay, how about next question? Again for extra credit. What is metaphysics concerned with? Okay, the theory of reality. It's not really nature, Daniela. Nature is physics. Metaphysics is what is ultimately real. Nature, physics is better answer to nature. But anyway, okay. So William, I guess, gets second extra credit, but you can see what's coming up next. What is logic concerned with? And let's see if somebody else can answer this first. Nope, it's not virtue. Logic. Yeah, reason is better answer. And Biniam, by the way, took Philosophy 102 with me, so he should know. Logic is concerned with reasoning and arguments. That's what logic is concerned with. Okay, so Biniam gets extra credit for this one. Again, we'll be doing it every class, so don't worry if you didn't get it, but every time be prepared. Take a look at the review, take a look at the material and think about it, and then you will be well prepared to get extra credit. Okay, so the types of knowledge which we can distinguish, and in particular which Xenophanes was distinguishing, is as follows. Note that this is again very important. How do you determine what is knowledge and what is just belief? We were talking about relativism last time, and the introduction talks about relativism. So what's relativism? It's to say that my belief is just as good as your belief, right? I believe things are this way, you believe things are not that way, so why should you be any more right than I am? So for example, if I believe that elections were rigged and you believe they were not rigged, well, it's my opinion, that's your opinion, that's just all opinion. So what exactly is knowledge? How is it different from opinion? So Xenophanes was saying that there is a difference between a certain state of affairs being true. P is true. P is, like in philosophy, we can say any state of affairs. So for example, let's say P is elections were rigged. So there's a difference between P is true and somebody, let's call him A, correctly believing that P is true. So let's say elections were rigged and somebody believes they were rigged. So in that case, that would be a true belief, right? Because he believes it correctly. But there's difference between that and knowledge. What's the difference between saying a person knows it to be true? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be proven, because proof is a very, very strong word, but you have to have rational justification. So naturally you would have to have some facts which you have to show, and based on these facts actually, well, at least try to prove that you are right. Like in the case of elections, you would actually have to bring some evidence. You would have to say, okay, look, I actually have this right here. This is the, dead people who are voting in the state or whatever. And then, for example, if you bring it to court, the judge will look at it and will say, it does look like that indeed they take place. So in order for you to say you know it, it's not enough to have a belief. And it's not even enough for your belief to be true. There has to be rational justification. So unless you have this rational justification, you don't have knowledge. You don't know that. It's just an opinion. But there's a difference between just an opinion and knowledge. And there's definitely such thing as knowledge. Okay, and now we have about 10 minutes to talk about Heraclitus. Heraclitus is such an enormous figure in philosophy and so interesting. He influenced many of the philosophers we will talk about in the end of the class. In particular, Nietzsche was saying that he is one of the most interesting and greatest philosophers ever. Hegel was saying the same thing. Why? well, his ideas are very different from what was before him. There are several important issues we should mention. Now, the way he was working is rather obscure, and for this reason he was known as an obscure one. But nonetheless, there is certain stuff there which we can really talk about, and it's very interesting. One of them is logos. He was using this Greek word logos, and he was saying, this is like actual quote from the beginning of his book we have, although this logos, which I shall describe, exists or is true forever, men prove as unable to understand it, when once they have heard it before they have heard it. So there is such thing as logos, but men for some reason don't understand it, at least most of them, right? For although all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, men seem as if ignorant when they experience such words and things, as I said forth, distinguishing each thing according to its nature and telling how it is. The rest of mankind are unaware of what they do while awake, just as they forget when they are asleep. Sorry about all the sounds. It's like difficult not to have any interruption when you're doing it live. Anyway, so what is the deal with the logos? Logos is a very important word for us to learn. And for this is something I actually like to do when we start talking about logos, to give you again a little bit of actual ancient Greek. And it looks very weird, isn't it? Because it's actually written in ancient Greek. So let's look at this quote. I did mention it again in a video, so some of you guys may even know what it is and where it's from. It starts Enarche en ho logos. Enarche en ho logos. We already know the word arche. What is arche? No, Thales thought it was water. Remember, Anaximander actually thought it was apiron. And Anaximenes thought it was what? Air. They all thought it was arche. So what is arche now? What's the word? The beginning. That's one way to translate it. Remember, it has several meanings. The beginning is one of them. But know that if you understand the ancient Greek, you actually understand that it's more than just the beginning. This is the nature of things. This is what things are from. So you can see that it starts at the beginning. At the beginning there was logos. Yes, this is from John 1:1. So I did talk about it. This is the beginning of John, beginning of New Testament. In the beginning there was word, enarche hen ho logos. Kai ho logos hen proston theon. Theon is God, so the word was with God. Kai theos he ho logos, and the word was God. So in the beginning there was a word, the word was with God, and the word was God. But why is it better to understand it in ancient Greek? Because first of all, the word arche is not just the beginning. But the word logos is also not just a word. It's a much more meaningful in Greek. Logos actually means, apart from meaning word, yes, Greeks were saying it is word, it also means statement, it means discourse. Like when people talk, you give me your logos, and I give you my logos. But more importantly, it also meant reason or rational content. So you can translate the same part. In the beginning there was reason, and the reason was with God, and the reason was God. Note that in English it already has totally different meaning than just in the beginning there was word. Doesn't it? In fact, for this reason many people start to learn ancient Greek in order to read the Bible, the New Testament, because Old Testament is written in Hebrew. But New Testament is written in Greek. Well, in fact, it's not ancient Greek, it's Koine. Koine is kind of a slightly simplified version of ancient Greek, because the New Testament was written in the about 1st century of our time. So it is like several hundred years after Plato and so on. Plato is the last one who actually wrote in the Attic dialect of the ancient Greek. But it doesn't matter. They're very similar. There's very little differences between them. So, yes, logos is a very, very interesting word. And this is also where the word logic comes from. The word logic is related to Greek logike, which means the word of which is spoken or the reasoning. So that's again the connection to this very interesting word. And when you try to understand Heraclitus, you have to remember that logos to him doesn't just mean word, statement, or whatever people are saying. It means reason or rational content, the correct way of saying and understanding things. And the reason or logos is your path to knowledge. So that is the difference between people just saying things, having some sort of an opinion, and people actually reasoning and having opinion which is based on facts, which is based on reality. Couple of other things about Heraclitus. He is famous for saying everything changes. In fact, Plato quotes him by supposedly saying, you cannot step into the same river twice. Why can't you step into the same river twice? What's going on? Can't you step into Mississippi twice? What do you think, guys? Can you? The water is flowing, isn't it? So is it the same Mississippi? What exactly do we call Mississippi? I mean, if you're talking about this bunch of water there, that actually doesn't, make any sense, because that water indeed is constantly flowing. So when you come back tomorrow, that will be a completely different river, wouldn't it? Would you call just this land a river? How about if it had no water? Would it still be Mississippi? What, like Mississippi Valley? Well, in any case, Heraclitus actually meant that not just rivers changing, everything changes, me and you changing. Today we are different than we were yesterday, and certainly different than we were 10 years ago. So he's saying in this world, everything constantly changes, and everything is a unity of opposites. Day and night are kind of two sides of this same coin. Hot and cold, they only can be understood in relation to each other. He was saying everything is also fire. Fire is measure of all things. This world order, this cosmos, the same for all, none of the gods or man has made, but it always is and shall be ever living fire, which has been kindled in measures and extinguished in measures. So everything we see around us is fire, but taking different shapes of people. Justice, he was saying, is strife. In fact, he was saying there's no justice other than things fighting each other. War is the father of all and king of all, and some he shows as gods, others as humans. Some he makes slaves, some others free. It is necessary to know that war is common and justice is strife, and that all things happen in accordance with strife and necessity. So what he's trying to say here is that when you think about war as a bad thing, well, without war there would not be a good thing. Without evil there would not be good. Without hot there would not be cold. So actually strife, or this kind of a constant fighting of things, that is justice. He's saying justice is not some sort of equal measure. Justice is actually inequality. Kind of an interesting idea, isn't it? So everything is kind of united, but it's united in terms of opposites. He was comparing it to the bow or the lyre. He was saying it's a backward turning attunement like that of the bow. So what does he mean? The bow is in constant tension, isn't it? That's what makes it a bow. If you remove the tension, what do you have? Just a stick. It's no longer a bow. Same with the lyre. Lyre is like this instrument for playing music. How does it play music? Well, the strings have to be under pressure. If they don't have this kind of constant pressure, it's not going to play. There won't be any music. So, kind of interesting idea. He influenced, like I said, a lot of people. And we're kind of running out of time for this discussion. Let's do it next time. But before we say goodbye, remember the chapter 2 now I moved kind of the reading of it until Wednesday. So it's due kind of tomorrow midnight. Please make sure you read it by next time, because we'll talk about the other half of it. This is the first half of chapter 2. Next time we'll talk about the other half and kind of wrap up all this pre-Socratic philosophy. Okay, I guess we're out of time now. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll try to give you more time for discussion, but with pre-Socratics especially it's difficult because there's so much stuff and so many important things. So hopefully you enjoyed it. And again, that's all the time we have. We're already past the limit. It's 3:23. Okay, well, so thank you guys, and make sure to read the chapter, and I'll see you on Wednesday, hopefully.